For the last couple weeks, we've been talking about what it means to fight for your faith and stand firm in that fight. And we've been looking through some of the pieces of God's armor that Paul talks about in the New Testament. Last week, we talked about the first piece of armor, the belt of truth. And we're moving forward and looking at the next piece, the body armor, the piece of the armor that guards, you guessed it, your body. So it's time for me to nerd out. When I was 15, I joined a medieval recreation group. And basically this meant that we dressed up in costumes, we like to call it garb, and we'd fight each other with swords, much like this. And one of these types of combat involved getting all geared up in a full suit of armor and going at it. So imagine wearing something like this all day long in the hot sun. It was brutal. And there was this one year where we had a booth at the Spring Fling. And basically it was a spring carnival hosted by the university. And my job was walking around in a suit of armor. And I got some looks, as you can imagine, but the weirdest thing was that people wanted to see that if it was real. And even touching it, it's kind of obvious that this is hard metal. But the strangest thing happened. People asked if they could punch me in the guts. Like, why? Why would you want to punch a dude in full armor in the stomach? Probably because some people are not very smart, and they thought if they hit this dude hard enough that they can prove that this 16 gauge steel is not stronger than their fist. It is. It's stronger. But for whatever reason, they thought that this was a good idea. And me, being a smallish 15-year-old kid, thought, yep, this is hilarious. So I let them. And there was this really big guy, I remember this guy. He was probably in his mid-20s and he was built. He was strong. And I remember he wound up and he punched me and hit me as hard as he could right in the stomach. And his fist collided with the armor and burst through it and plowed me in the stomach, sending me flying like some sort of anime super punch. No, wait, that's not what happened. You know what happened? It was probably what you all guessed would happen. Absolutely nothing. I was not knocked back. The armor did exactly what it was supposed to do, and it stopped his fist. Well, let's be honest, it really actually hurt his fist. Imagine just straight up punching a piece of solid steel. Yeah, it hurts. And over again this happened. I'd get punched, and the dude would hurt their hand. Why? Because the body armor was doing exactly what it was meant to do. Protect my body. When it comes to the fight for our faith, Paul gives us a list of armor that we should put on every day. And we're not talking about this as physical armor, but more metaphorical armor. It's what each of these items represent. And remember, context of what we're reading is so important. Paul's letter is written to the church of Ephesus, a group of new followers of Jesus just like you and I, located on the edge of modern-day Turkey. Now, something to remember about people in this time. War, guards, armor, fighting, all of this was normal to their daily life. They saw people in armor all the time. Roman soldiers would have been normal to see. So they understood what this representation was all about. And that is why Paul put this concept of the armor of God as a basis for living and fighting for your faith. So when Paul says put on the full armor of God and he walks us through each item, he's telling us put on these characteristics of God and our faith in Jesus. Verse 13, therefore put on every piece of God's armor so you'll be able to resist the enemy in the time of evil. Then after the battle you will be standing firm. Stand your ground, putting on the belt of truth and the body armor of God's righteousness. Ephesians 6:13 through 14.
What does it mean to you to live in a way that is honorable to God, or living in righteousness? Leah, what does that mean to you?
Personally, when growing up, my mom and my dad always said your life and doctrine have to go hand in hand. Because as a Christian, you're supposed to represent the whole community and you're supposed to show godliness to other people. So if you yourself are not following life and doctrine, and if you're going out and you're doing things and then the next day you're saying, oh, God doesn't want you to do that, but you just did that the other day, then you're not being a good example of a Christian for other people that may be looking into, going in after God and trying to develop a relationship with him?
I mean, kind of going back to the whole, the truth, the belt of truth holds everything together. I actually had that explained to me in high school, how it literally holds all the armor together. But in terms of like righteousness and kind of living that out, is that you have to understand the spiritual truths and acknowledge them, and really focus on the fruits of the Spirit versus trying to, when God says, like, do not do these things, not trying so hard to do those, but trying to focus on having peace, love, joy, kindness, etc. And even like I said, righteousness. But, it kind of not letting the world tell you what's true, and just understanding what the Bible says is true, and, grabbing a hold of that, because I think that that's hard for anyone, no matter where you are in your walk.
Did you have any fears or concerns about accepting Christ and God's righteousness? Was it a struggle?
Personally, I think that was one of the toughest moments of my life, was struggling with faith. And when I hit 9th grade, that was the hardest year I've had so far, because I encountered a lot of things that I was struggling with, and I had a lot of problems going on at that time, and I refused to believe in God, because I asked, how could God love me, and how could God create everything and still let me be as miserable as I am? But I think that struggle is so important, because once you give in and once you realize that God is there for you and that he has a plan, and that pain is part of the plan, you're surrendering so much more than just, your life. You're surrendering your whole entire being, your emotions and everything. You're giving up everything to him, which I think it promotes a stronger bond. So for me personally, when I gave in to God, I created a bond that I don't think I could ever destroy, because I struggled so hard. And then the moment I let that go was paramount for my journey with God.
I think the hardest part was the tests that came after, since I did do it at such a young age, if that makes sense. Because, once you grow closer to God, sometimes that's how Satan can see some sort of vulnerability, and he will try to tighten his grip on you, even when you're closer to God. And that's something that's really hard to grasp, but it's true.
When it comes to this concept of a battle, we have to remember that there is an enemy that wants nothing but to destroy our faith, destroy our relationship with God, destroy the good and the joy in our lives. And for those of you who are followers of Jesus, you know this to be true. Satan, the devil, is that enemy. And if you're new to church and Jesus, then this might be a bit of a foreign concept. And it's not some fear-mongering thing, being like, be afraid of the devil because he's gonna get you. But it's being mindful that there is an enemy. And that enemy doesn't want you to win, and doesn't want you to succeed, and wants you to live far and disconnected from God. So when it comes to being mindful of that enemy and being prepared, we come to our big idea for today. Satan is no match for the righteousness of God. A police officer doesn't just go into a dangerous situation with no care. They take precaution. They use tactics. They keep out of harm's way to the best of their ability. The armor is there when their own defenses fail. And just like a police officer or soldier gets ready and prepares, we have to do the same thing with our hearts. Righteousness is really the ability to live in perfect harmony with God, to be in right standing with him. It's living at a higher standard, moralistically higher than anything else, and to be connected with him at all times and honor him with how we live our lives. Easier said than done, right? But when we decide to put on the armor of God, we are accepting his righteousness. That doesn't mean we just say, woohoo, I'm all good with God now, I can do whatever I want. But it does mean that when we let our own guard down, when we do make mistakes, that those things don't ultimately destroy us and don't have to be a debilitating attack. So here's the challenge in all of this. There are two things that we need to do. First off, accept God's righteousness. When Paul tells us to put on the body armor of God's righteousness, he's helping us to remember that when our own defenses fail, it's God's righteousness that keeps us safe. It's the righteousness of Jesus that it's there to protect us. It's not our ability to be right with God, but what Jesus did for us, his righteousness. It trumps anything that we could bring to the table. It's his righteousness that helps us to live in a way that brings us closer into relationship with him. And the assurance is not on our ability to be right, to be perfect. Because the fact of the matter is that we're not going to be perfect. Perfection is unattainable by human standards. And if you've ever tried to never mess up and never make a mistake, you probably understand that it's impossible. But it's not our righteousness. It's not our ability that makes us right with God. It's what Jesus did. It's his perfect life. It was the fact that he never sinned. If you've never made the decision to follow Jesus and accept his righteousness, his grace towards us, I'm going to give you the opportunity to do that later as we walk towards communion. But if you have in the past, but you've been just trying to do it all on your own, and here's the reminder that it's not all for you to do. Accept his righteousness. Secondly, live in God's righteousness. In the book of Titus, a letter, another one written by Paul that is all about living in leadership as a follower of Jesus, Paul says this: "And we are instructed to turn from godless living and sinful pleasures. We should live in this evil world with wisdom, righteousness, and devotion to God." Titus chapter 2, verse 12. See, this is the choice that's not always easier, but it's what leads to living a life of purpose and peace and joy in the midst of any circumstance. It's choosing to live in a righteous way, in the honorable, in the way that honors God, and taking the step to do the right thing even when it's hard. To choosing to go against what the norm is and live in a way that represents Jesus. And the reason for this is not simply to show who Jesus is to those around you. That's a huge bonus and an important part, but it's also to live in a way that helps us to stand firm and fight for our faith. So I want to encourage you this week. There are going to be times when you fall down. There are going to be moments when your defenses fail. There are going to be moments that seem too tough. And it's in those moments that we have to remember that Satan, the enemy, is no match for the righteousness of God. There is nothing in this world that is a match for what God has done and his righteousness. So this week, lean into that truth. Put on his armor every day and face every circumstance, every challenge with this truth that his protection is there.